will go straight into the playing of John Piper's message. Let me know if y'all have a volume issue there in the comments.
On how to manage this paradox or mystery that God forbids things he brings about. And God commands things that he hinders from happening. That in one sense something is the will of God, and in another sense that same something is not the will of God. Without this category of thought, I don't think you can make sense out of the Bible, the God of the Bible. So let's look at these two kinds of willing. Here's number one. Let's call it either the sovereign will of God or his will of decree. It means God's sovereign control of everything that comes to pass. It's one of the clearest teachings of the Bible. Let's look at some verses. I think I'll just quote them. You can jot them down and look at them later, but you know them, most of them. Matthew 26:39, Jesus is in Gethsemane, and he prays like this, Father.
Okay, before we go to the verses, let me make sure we're following what John Piper's teaching here. This is well known as the two wills of God. And matter of fact, if you typed in John Piper and the two wills of God, you would pull up an article from John Piper that gives this explanation in more detail. He's just touching on it here in this sermon. And so I want to give a little bit more explanation of what he's talking about. He's talking about when he says the two wills of God, he's talking about the prescriptive, which is the external will of God, like thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not kill. That would be the external, the decree, the declaration of God. I do not want you to do this evil, okay? That's an external thing. That is not necessarily what's going to happen, though, okay? So what happens in this world is not necessarily in accordance with his prescriptive or external commands. Got that? The internal, or what he just called the sovereign decree, that is what will take place. That is the script, if you will. That is what God has declared from the beginning will certainly happen. And so what you have in seemingly competition here is God on one hand saying, thou shalt not kill. And then on the other hand, decreeing for the death of his own son, Jesus. And so you've got those kinds of situations where you've got something external, don't kill, and then internal or secret, I decreed the killing of my son. And that somehow these two have to be simultaneously understood. In a category to understand the Bible, you have to understand these two distinct and separate wills, one which seems to be working against the other. Don't do this, but I have decreed for you to do this. Now, what the Calvinists will do is they won't only use things like the crucifixion, but they will say that in the same way that the crucifixion was brought to pass by a sovereign will, every minute detail, every sinful thought, every sinful desire, everything is brought to pass in that same meticulously sovereign way. And so every time you've ever sinned, every time you've ever had a sinful thought, all of it was ultimately brought to pass or decreed by God. He is the one who decided it beforehand. And that is what they mean by the secret or sovereign decree of God. They will use things like God's predetermination of the crucifixion as their example, their biblical example, to prove that God determines everything, that God ultimately brings about everything by saying things like, well, look, he predetermined the death of his son. Therefore, that shows that he can predetermine evil things and still not be guilty for it. Therefore, that gives us the grounds by which to say God predetermines every sinful thing, thought, action, and deed, and he's sinless in doing it. And it's a mystery as to how he's sinless in doing it on Calvinism. But nonetheless, because he can bring about the crucifixion sinlessly without guilt, that proves that he can bring about everything sinlessly without guilt. And therefore, he does bring about everything sinlessly and without guilt mysteriously. And we just don't know how exactly he does that. That's what John Piper teaches. I'm not basing that just on this message. I'm basing it upon the swath of material I have read from John Piper and listened to John Piper. And so I'm not trying to misrepresent him. In fact, you'll hear me play the people I'm representing very clearly. Now, you may be a different kind of Calvinist than John Piper, and you may therefore go, oh, Leighton's misrepresenting Calvinism. Well, maybe it is that I'm misrepresenting your form of Calvinism, but I'm pretty certain that I'm not misrepresenting John Piper's form of Calvinism, because I'm letting John Piper speak for himself, and I'm responding to his form of Calvinism, which happens to be very influential in the United States today. And so keep that in mind as we go through this.
If it is possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as you will. Matthew 26:39. What does as you will mean? What kind of will of God is that? Well, it means his plan for Jesus to be crucified. If there's no other way, Father, if that is the infinitely wise way, the infinitely loving way, the infinitely just way, do what you must do. And he did it. And here's the crucial thing to observe. It was shot through with sin and could not have happened without sin. It's a sin to kill the Son of God. It's a sin to mock the Son of God. It's a sin to whip the Son of God with stripes prophesied in the Old Testament. It's a sin to be expedient and wash your hands and hand him over. And yet, we all know from Acts chapter 4, verse 27, truly in this city they were gathered together against your holy servant Jesus, whom you anointed, both Herod and Pontius Pilate, along with the Gentiles and peoples of Israel, to do whatever your hand and your plan had predestined to take place. The script was written for this night and this Good Friday in Isaiah 53 in great detail, and in Psalm 22, and in many other passages. The script was written. The will of God is a fixed, determinate purpose to bring about the death of his Son, Isaiah 53:10.
So that script on Calvinism is not just bringing about redemption for sin. That script is all the sin too. So what Calvinists will mistakenly do is take examples in Scripture where God does decree something, bring something to pass, determine something to happen, and they will use that as a proof text to say, this is what God does all the time, and this is how God always does it. And therefore, you've got God redeeming sins that he actually brought to pass, which seems a little bit backwards, if not completely upside down, to ultimately say that because God determined the crucifixion, the redemption of sin, therefore he must have also determined all the sin that he died to redeem. Again, that's just a non sequitur. It does not follow. It does not follow that because God worked within history to ensure the crucifixion of his Son for the redemption of sin, that therefore he brought about all sin that needs to be redeemed. And I know you all who listen on a regular basis to the podcast, I know you've heard illustrations and things that I've used a number of times, but keep in mind that there are new people who tune in on a regular basis. And one of the reasons that I use illustrations is to help to bring something into context and to help us to understand it better. And many of you are familiar with the police sting operation analogy, where we talk about how even a police officer can bring about a crime through a sting operation. For example, when they hide their identity and a cop becomes one of the drug dealers and hides amongst them, and he pretends to be one of them, and he helps to orchestrate a particular selling of drugs at a particular time and place so as to catch the drug dealers in the town. Well, this is the sting operation. The police know who the criminals are. They know the evil intentions of the criminals, and they know that if they're given the opportunity to sell and buy drugs, they'll actually do that. And so that's what they do. They set up this selling and buying of drugs at this particular place and time, a criminal activity, but for a good end. Well, in this scenario, in this situation, the police aren't responsible for the criminals being criminals. The police don't bring about criminal behavior. They're not causing all crime in order to stop some of it. They're simply stepping into the criminal world so as to bring about one particular event, an evil event, the selling of drugs, for a good cause. This gives us an example of what we might see in situations where God, for example, hardens the heart of Judas, gives him over to his pride and his lust for money, and uses him in his rebellion to bring about his own redemptive good and his own redemptive plan. How he might harden Pharaoh so as to bring about the first Passover, in the same way that he might harden Israel as a whole to bring about the second Passover. And what does hardening mean? To cut somebody off in their already rebellious ways. In other words, to strengthen one in their resolve is what harden is. And so somebody is already a hardened criminal, for example. To judicially harden a criminal wouldn't be to make them into a criminal. It would be taking somebody who was already a criminal and using them like in a sting operation to bring about a good purpose through their evil activity. Well, God, being all-knowing, is certainly capable of doing this. If a police officer could do it with his limited amount of knowledge and capabilities, how much more so could God do this, knowing full well the heart of Pharaoh, the heart of Judas, the heart of Pilate, the heart of people that he uses in time to bring about his purposes through their rebellious activity. So that's how we would explain these kinds of things, where God is not sovereignly bringing about the evil intentions of Judas and Pilate and Herod and all of these people that are mentioned in the crucifixion, or before that, back in the Old Testament days, of Pharaoh or of Joseph's brothers in Genesis. All of these examples are examples that Calvinists will prop up as saying, therefore, because Joseph's brothers did something with an evil intent and God meant it for good, therefore, God must ultimately mean all evil intentions. He must be purposefully bringing about all evil intentions, all evil actions for good, in the same way he did with with Joseph's brothers, in the same way he did with Pharaoh, in the same way he did with Judas and Pilate and Herod. And that's nowhere established in the pages of Scripture. Nowhere does it ever say in the Bible that God sovereignly decrees all sinful intentions, actions, choices of creatures. It just never does. This is something that's systematically read into the text, not something that is clearly taught from the Scriptures.